At 5:47 a.m. on August 22, 1942, inside a sand-stained operations room in Cairo, a 22-year-old woman nobody outside the building had ever heard of stared at a canvas map taller than she was and realized something was disastrously wrong. The desert outside was still dark, the night wind still carrying the metallic taste of blown sand. But the numbers glowing under the lamps in front of her made her feel colder than any dawn air ever could. The Eighth Army, nearly 200,000 men scattered across the North African front, was advancing toward Rommel with fuel projections based on a calculation that was wrong by double digits. Not one officer in 3 months had noticed the error. She had, and the mistake was large enough to collapse the entire front. Her name was Margaret Ellis, assistant logistics analyst, daughter of a railway clerk, no military pedigree, no battlefield rank, only a habit of checking things others assumed were already correct. Her desk sat in the back corner of the Middle East Command's logistics pit, a place colonels passed through without making eye contact. Yet right now, one line of pencil marks on the canvas told her the Eighth Army was on course to arrive at its next defensive line with fuel reserves 23% lower than headquarters believed. 23% was not a rounding error. In the desert, 23% was the difference between an armored division arriving ready to fight or arriving empty-engined, gasping crews trapped inside steel coffins. For 3 months, British logistics officers had insisted that supply losses averaged 13% along the Alexandria-El Magne Road, a figure inherited from European road doctrine. But that doctrine had never accounted for desert physics, evaporation at 46 degrees, stealing fuel from sealed drums, sand clogging carburetors, trucks idling longer, windstorms forcing convoys to crawl at walking speed. Margaret had spent the last 2 nights rechecking the convoy logs, comparing unit diaries and tallying discrepancies others had dismissed as clerical noise. What she found was terrifyingly consistent. The real fuel loss rate was not 13%. It was 36%, almost triple, enough to turn a coordinated advance into a stalled disaster by the end of the week. She pushed her hair behind her ear, steadying her breath. Her pencil hovered over the map as the room hummed with the quiet monotony of shift change chatter. She knew what had to happen next. She had to interrupt the briefing that would begin in less than 3 minutes, the one attended by 2 generals and the commander of the armored corps. The thought made her stomach knot. She was 22, she was a civilian, and she was about to tell the most powerful officers in North Africa that their numbers were wrong, catastrophically wrong. Behind her, a door slammed. The operations room shifted from drowsy quiet to organized tension as officers filed in, their boots scraping against the sand-dusted floor, papers rustling like a gathering storm. General Whitford, broad-shouldered and impatient even at dawn, stepped to the head of the table. His eyes swept the map, then the room, looking for confirmations rather than questions. Margaret felt her pulse thudding in her ears. Her calculation notebook lay open in front of her, its pages filled with the numbers she wished were wrong. She swallowed hard, gripping its edges. One of the senior logisticians, Colonel Pierce, leaned over the table, tapping the canvas with a polished stick. Convoys Alpha through Delta have arrived on schedule. Fuel projections remain within tolerance. The phrase struck her like a slap. She knew the convoys had arrived, but she also knew the logs recorded far more evaporation and mechanical bleed-off than anyone had accounted for. Pierce continued, "Frontline units should maintain operational mobility for 72 hours. The officers nodded, accepting the statement as fact because it sounded calm and authoritative. Margaret's fingers trembled. She imagined the tanks bogging down in open desert, engines coughing, crews stranded miles from cover. A 72-hour mobility window was a fantasy built on broken math. She took one careful step forward. "Sir, the fuel projections are incorrect." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the sudden stillness it carried through the room like a flare. Heads turned. Some faces registered annoyance, others confusion. Colonel Pierce's brows furrowed deeply, as if the interruption itself was more offensive than the possibility of error. General Whitford lifted a hand. "State your concern, Miss Ellis." His tone was clipped, neutral, but it was enough permission to make her knees feel dangerously weak. She opened her notebook, exposing the columns of meticulously aligned figures. "The loss rate isn't 13%. Based on the last 30 convoy reports, it averages 36. A ripple of disbelief moved across the table. One adjutant scoffed under his breath. Another officer muttered something about clerical misinterpretations and rookie arithmetic. Margaret kept her voice steady. I rechecked the logs twice, triple-checked the evaporation figures. I cross-referenced mechanical failure reports with unit diaries. The pattern is consistent, Colonel Pierce's jaw tightened. Impossible, those logs were verified. His tone implied not just disagreement, but irritation that someone so junior dared challenge months of accepted data. She took a breath. Sir, the logs weren't wrong. The assumptions were. The room froze. For the first time, several officers leaned in, sensing the conversation had crossed into dangerous territory. General Whitford stepped closer to the map, his expression tightening as he scanned her numbers. Show me, he said, not skeptical, commanding. The single phrase sent a tremor through the room. Margaret placed her notebook beside the supply routes on the canvas. These convoys reported fuel shrinkage far above projected. Heat exposure, idling delays, sand friction. The cumulative losses are exponential. Whitford traced the dotted lines with a gloved finger. If what you're saying is accurate, the armored divisions will hit phase line Garnet with tanks at half operational range. Half operational range. The words hung like a sentence. Officers exchanged uneasy looks, the kind that acknowledged fear without admitting it aloud. Pierce bristled. General, with respect, this analysis undermines months of planning. Our models are based on proven European standards. His voice sharpened defensively. Whitford shot him a glare. Europe isn't the Sahara. His words cut through the tension, and for the first time, cracks formed in Pierce's confidence. Margaret slid forward a convoy report. Sir, this is Convoy Delta's log from 10 days ago. Recorded evaporation alone cost them an additional 18 barrels, nearly a full truck's worth. An intelligence officer leaned in, squinting. 18? That can't be right. Margaret turned the page, revealing the signatures of the convoy officers themselves. It was right. Whitford exhaled slowly, a long, heavy breath, the kind leaders take when they realize a problem is real and enormous. The room fell completely silent. Pierce, Whitford said, why didn't this reach my desk? The colonel stiffened, his mouth opened, then closed. No answer came. Margaret spoke before the tension could thicken. Sir, the reports were logged correctly. They were never consolidated. Each discrepancy was treated as an outlier. Whitford turned back to her. And you consolidated them, she nodded, heart hammering. For a moment, he simply studied her, seeing not a clerk but a mind the army had nearly overlooked. He straightened. Get me the full 3-month compilation. Every convoy, every battalion, every deviation. Officers scrambled instantly, the room snapping into motion around her. Margaret clutched her notebook, realizing her work was no longer a quiet correction in the back corner. It had become the pivot on which the next week of war might turn. As runners dashed from the room and senior staff clustered around updated figures, Margaret felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. Not crushing, but clarifying. By 1900, the compiled figures were sprawled across tables and maps. Whitford paced, muttering numbers, recalculating fuel lines, distances, convoy speeds, evaporation. Margaret followed each calculation silently, confirming the patterns she had already drawn. The teleprinters clattered in the background like distant gunfire. Every new message confirmed her calculations. Fuel losses were real, cumulative, and exact. Every officer who had ignored the desert's arithmetic now had no choice but to pay attention. Whitford looked at her. If we do nothing, phase line Garnet will see nearly half the tanks out of action before contact. That's catastrophic. His voice wavered, just slightly, but enough for Margaret to hear. Margaret felt no fear, only clarity. Numbers didn't care about rank or protocol. The math was immutable, brutal, precise. 19% loss multiplied across distances, vehicles, and time. Every missing gallon was a potential death. Then we changed the route, she said. The room froze, officers blinked. Whitford's gaze softened slightly, a hint of trust. You're sure? He asked. Margaret nodded, 100%. There was no room for doubt. Maps and pencils were deployed. Route Delta 3 was redrawn, a subtle curve westward, avoiding the worst crosswinds, flatter sands, minimizing evaporation. Every variable Margaret had calculated was represented in a single chalk line. She traced it with her finger, imagining the trucks rolling across it. Fuel saved, lives preserved, armor maneuvering. For the first time, the logistics of the desert bent in her favor. She could almost feel the pulse of the army's survival. Whitford leaned over the map. If this works, he didn't finish. Margaret didn't need him to. She knew it would. The chalk line wasn't a suggestion. It was a lifeline. Orders were sent immediately. Convoy commanders were awakened. Vehicles fueled, drivers briefed. The change was subtle, invisible to most. But to the engines and fuel tanks, it was monumental. By 0400, the first trucks followed the new alignment. Engines strained less, tires spun more easily. Drivers noticed the difference instinctively, though they couldn't articulate why. The desert, which had been an enemy, was marginally kinder. Margaret monitored the signals, recalculated on the fly, and silently adjusted projections. Every saved gallon meant artillery could fire longer, armor could maneuver farther, and infantry would have mobility when it mattered. By 10:20, confirmation arrived. Delta III's consumption was 8% lower than expected. The 19% deficit had already been partially corrected. Margaret didn't exhale, she recalculated. Numbers, not relief, were her currency. By noon, the convoy reached its midpoint. Losses were minimal, the trucks unbroken, engines running smoothly. Margaret checked each report, updating the charts. Every mile traveled now meant fuel delivered, not lost. She imagined the chalk curve drawn across the desert, now real, carved into sand by dozens of wheels. The trucks weren't just following a line. They were following her logic, her math, her foresight. On the front line, the 22nd Armored Brigade prepared for movement. Tanks started fully fueled. Drivers weren't scrambling. Commanders weren't rationing. Units were ready for the first time in months. Logistics had given them strength. Mechanics checked vehicles with less urgency. Emergency repairs weren't needed. The army was moving with confidence for the first time in months. Margaret's calculations were manifesting on the battlefield, quietly reshaping the rhythm of war. Rommel's intelligence assumed British forces would falter from lack of fuel. His scouts reported tanks positioned earlier, deeper and ready to maneuver. Timetables slipped, formations were unexpected, and the Africa Corps found their advantage evaporating. A single delayed timetable in tank warfare wasn't minor, it was catastrophic. The desert favored speed, mobility, and logistics. For the first time in months, British forces weren't slower. In some sectors, they were even faster. Margaret monitored dispatches with cold precision. Fuel reserves were increasing. Units could move, artillery could fire, and armored brigades could counterattack. She noted each figure, knowing that the math had finally turned the tide. At 11:40, a request for limited counterattack authorization arrived. Margaret absorbed the information slowly. The British could finally fight offensively, not defensively. Supply curves held, consumption stabilized, and the battlefield responded. Convoy Delta III maintained its consumption curve. Losses remained at 4%, far below the previous 19%. Deliveries exceeded projections by nearly 30%. Numbers, cold and precise, validated her calculations in real time. The second convoy followed the adjusted route, arriving with minor attrition. Margaret recalculated continuously. Every extra gallon preserved translated into operational freedom, maneuverability, and survivability for the 8th Army. By the afternoon, reports confirmed that armor could advance without emergency rationing. Mechanics weren't scrambling. Units moved in coordination. Officers who had ignored her numbers began to notice the effect. The operational impact was immediate. Artillery units fired full sequences. Armored brigades advanced on schedule. Coordination across multiple divisions improved dramatically. A single chalk line had cascaded into tangible battlefield advantage. Rommel's forces had begun their push, expecting British fuel shortages to stall them. But armored units had mobility, artillery had endurance, and logistics allowed sustained operations. The assumptions of the enemy were collapsing.